Imagine waking up and not knowing whether it is day or night. Imagine opening your eyes, or what remains of your eyes, because perhaps one of them has already been replaced by a crude augmetic lens that feeds dim, greenish light directly into the back of your skull, and realizing that the concept of morning no longer applies to you. There is no sun where you live. There has not been a sun visible from where you stand in decades, perhaps in generations. The sky above the forge world is a perpetual smear of industrial smoke, a churning, toxic cathedral of ash and promethium fumes so thick that even the twin moons, on the rare occasions when workers remember that moons exist, are nothing more than pale, half-imagined suggestions behind a wall of gray and orange haze. This is your home. This is the only home you have ever known. This is the forge world, and it is eternal, and it is hungry, and it will consume everything you have, every hour of every cycle, until there is nothing left of you to give. And when that day comes, what remains of your body will be recycled into the very machines you spent your life feeding. The forge worlds of the Adeptus Mechanicus are unlike any other human habitat in the Imperium of man. They are not hive worlds, though they share some of the same crushing density of population. They are not death worlds, though the mortality rate among the laboring caste would make even a veteran of Catachan pause. They are something entirely their own, vast, engine-driven planetoids given over entirely to the production of war material, sacred machinery, processed or refined fuel, and the 10,000 other outputs that keep the Imperium's wars grinding forward. From orbit, a forge world looks like a wound on the surface of a planet. It looks like something that should not be alive, and yet it breathes if you can call the belching of furnace stacks breathing, and it pulses if you can call the rhythm of 10 billion hammers pulsing, and it screams if you can call the endless mechanical shriek of production lines screaming. And somewhere inside all of that, buried under the smoke and the noise and the heat and the doctrine and the ritual and the machine psalm and the oil prayer, there are human beings trying to live. The worker caste on a forge world is a vast and stratified thing. At the very bottom, performing the most physically demanding and most spiritually unrewarded labor, are the Scutarii aspirants who have not yet earned augmentation, and below even them in social terms, the bonded laborers, humans who were born into indentured service to the Mechanicus and who will die in it. These are the furnace tenders, the ore haulers, the slag clearers, the coolant pipe runners, the tunnel diggers, and the assembly line operators who perform the same 14 repetitive motions every cycle for the entirety of their working lives. These people are not slaves in the technical sense that the Imperium recognizes, because the Mechanicus does not call them slaves. They are called bondsmen or laborates or manufactorum serfs depending on which forge world you are standing on and which Mugos oversees the district. But the distinction between those words and the word slave is thin enough to be measured in microns, and the Mechanicus would be the first to tell you that the measurement of things in microns is one of the things they do best. A laborer's cycle, they do not call it a day because again, there is no day, is typically divided into 3 shifts of 8 standard hours each, though the interpretation of standard varies considerably depending on the forge world in question and the mood of whatever Mugos Logis oversees the production quotas. In practice, shifts frequently run longer. Production quotas are sacred obligations in the theology of the Omnicia, and a quota that has not been met by the end of a shift is a spiritual failure as much as an economic one. Shift supervisors, many of whom are low-grade tech priests with just enough augmentation to give them authority and just enough ambition to be dangerous about it, will extend the working period rather than report a shortfall to their superiors. The laborers have no formal mechanism for objecting to this. The concept of labor negotiation is not part of the Mechanicus theological framework. The machines must be fed. The machines must produce. The will of the Omnicia is expressed through output, and output does not take breaks. The physical environment inside a working forge world is something that defies easy description because the human mind, lacking the correct augmetic implants, struggles to process it all at once. The heat is the first thing. It is not the heat of a warm room or even the heat of a desert midday. It is the heat of proximity to industrial furnaces burning at temperature sufficient to liquefy iron, to refine ceramite, to smelt the bones of a planet into usable alloy. Even in the residential tunnels, and calling them residential is generous, because they are really just sections of utility corridor that have been partitioned off with prefabricated panels and designated as sleeping areas, the temperature rarely drops below what an unaugmented human would consider dangerously uncomfortable. Workers sweat constantly. Hydration is a logistical problem that the Mechanicus takes surprisingly seriously, not out of concern for human comfort but because a dehydrated worker is an inefficient worker, and inefficiency is heresy. Water stations are positioned at intervals throughout the forge floor, dispensing mineral-rich fluid from pipes that run alongside the coolant systems. Workers are permitted to drink from these stations during designated intervals, and they do so quickly, because the intervals are short. The noise is the second thing. Forge worlds are loud in a way that is not merely uncomfortable but physically damaging over time. The sound of industrial machinery operating at full capacity, the stamping presses, the lathe arrays, the plasma cutters, the pneumatic hammers, the conveyor systems, the ventilation fans, the coolant pumps, creates a constant, layered roar that vibrates through the floor, through the walls, through the bones of everyone standing inside it. Workers who have served on the forge floor for more than a few years almost universally suffer from significant hearing loss. The Mechanicus considers this an acceptable sacrifice and will often replace the damaged ears with basic cochlear implants that restore functionality, though not quite the full richness of organic hearing. The implants also, not coincidentally, allow the Mechanicus to pipe in machine psalms and doctrinal hymns directly into the worker's auditory perception. This is framed as a spiritual benefit. Workers receive the wisdom of the omniscia directly through their augmented ears while they work. Whether the workers experience this as a blessing or as something closer to an inescapable soundtrack to their labor is not a question that appears in the doctrinal literature. The air is the third thing and in some ways the most insidious. Inside the forge floors themselves, the atmosphere is a complex cocktail of industrial particulates, metallic dust, chemical vapors from solvents and coolants and cutting fluids, and the byproducts of high-temperature combustion. Respirators are issued to workers who perform the most hazardous tasks in the most contaminated zones, but the respirators are old, and they are shared, and the filtration elements are not replaced as often as the technical manuals recommend, because filtration elements have a production cost and the Mechanicus accountancy systems weigh that cost against worker survival statistics and arrive at an acceptable median. Workers who spend their lives breathing forge air develop characteristic respiratory conditions. A deep, rattling cough that veterans of the forge floor call the iron lung. A persistent wheeze that worsens in cold air. A tendency toward shortness of breath that the workers themselves often simply accept as a natural consequence of growing older. It is not a natural consequence of growing older. It is a consequence of breathing poison for 30 years. But on a forge world, the two things feel like the same thing. Food on a forge world exists on a spectrum that runs from barely adequate to outright punishing depending on which caste you occupy and how close you are to the omniscia's favor. For the laboring caste, food is a fuel calculation. The Mechanicus approaches human nutrition with the same logic it applies to machine maintenance. A worker requires a certain caloric input to sustain a certain output, and the optimal diet is the one that achieves this at the lowest possible cost. This means that the typical laborer's meal is a calorie-dense, nutrient-fortified paste or block food, sometimes flavored with artificial additives that approximate the taste of something recognizably edible, sometimes not. It is served in communal feeding stations at the beginning and end of each shift, and workers eat quickly, standing up, from metal trays, surrounded by hundreds of other workers doing the same thing. There is no ceremony to the eating. There is no pleasure in it. There is intake and then there is return to work. On some forge worlds, particularly those with a longer tradition of worker management, there are small black markets in real food, dried fruit, protein bars of actual animal origin, stimulant drinks that taste of something other than recycled mineral water. And these markets are technically illegal and practically universal, because the desire to eat something that tastes like something is one of the most basic expressions of human dignity that even a forge world cannot entirely suppress. Sleep is a negotiation between the body and the demands of production. The Mechanicus acknowledges that human workers require sleep cycles to maintain cognitive function, and the official doctrine allocates 6 standard hours of rest per cycle to workers in the laboring caste. In practice, the commute to and from sleeping quarters, through crowded tunnels, past checkpoints, up and down levels, often consumes an hour or more of that allocation. The sleeping quarters themselves are tiered bunk arrangements in long, low rooms with minimal privacy and constant ambient noise from the machinery that never stops operating in the levels below. Sleep is not peaceful on a forge world. It is something you do because your body forces you to, wedged between strangers who smell of machine oil and exhausted sweat, while the floor vibrates faintly beneath you with the pulse of the furnaces that never go cold. Workers develop the ability to sleep through almost anything. This adaptation is sometimes mistaken for contentment by the Mugos overseers who conduct periodic welfare assessments. It is not contentment. It is the very specific exhaustion of people who have no alternative. The social life of Forge World workers is something that exists in defiance of the environment rather than in harmony with it. Human beings are social creatures even when everything around them is trying to prevent that, and the workers of a Forge World build communities in the margins of their existence. In the brief periods between shifts, in the shared language of people who perform the same labor, in the small acts of mutual aid that no Mechanicus doctrine mandates but which happen anyway because people are people. Work gangs develop internal hierarchies and solidarity. Experienced workers teach newer ones not just how to operate the machinery safely but how to navigate the social landscape of the forge floor, which supervisors can be reasoned with and which cannot, where the water stations with the cleanest output are, which medical stations have tech priests who will actually look at your injury rather than simply logging it for future reference. There is humor of a kind, dark, dry, heavily ironic humor that finds comedy in the enormity of the situation because the alternative is to find nothing funny at all. There are feuds and romances and friendships and rivalries that unfold across years of shared labor, compressed into the few waking hours that are not claimed by the machines. Children on Forge worlds occupy a complicated space. The Mechanicus is not fundamentally opposed to human reproduction among the laboring caste. Replacement workers must come from somewhere, and the infrastructure required to import large numbers of new laborers is not always practical. But children are not resources in the same way that adult workers are, and so their existence is tolerated and managed rather than celebrated. Creche facilities exist in the residential districts of most major Forge worlds, staffed by low-ranking Mechanicus functionaries and older workers who have been assigned care duties after their physical capacity for heavier labor has declined. Children are introduced to the Forge world's doctrinal education system from an early age, learning the catechisms of the machine, the prayers to the omnia, the basic principles of mechanical function that will underpin their working lives. Play is not formally prohibited for children on Forge worlds, but the spaces available for it are limited and the time allocated to it diminishes rapidly as the child grows older and begins to be assessed for work assignment. By the time a Forge world child reaches early adolescence, they are typically already performing supervised light labor tasks, and by mid-adolescence they are fully integrated into the workforce. The transition is considered normal. It is normal on a Forge world. Normal and terrible are not mutually exclusive. The Adeptus Mechanicus has a complex relationship with the idea of augmentation as it applies to the laboring caste. For the tech priests themselves, augmentation is a religious aspiration, the replacement of fallible flesh with reliable mechanism, the progressive shedding of the limitations of the biological in favor of the purity of the mechanical. For workers in the laboring caste, augmentation is something different. It is, on one level, a medical intervention, replacing a limb lost in an industrial accident, restoring a sensory function damaged by years of harsh conditions. On another level, it is a marker of status and progression within the Mechanicus hierarchy. A worker who has received augmetic replacements is, in a technical sense, closer to the ideal of the omniscia's servant than a worker who remains entirely organic. But the augmentations available to laboring caste workers are not the sophisticated, finely crafted implants that adorn the bodies of senior tech priests. They are functional, utilitarian, often secondhand. A worker who loses an arm in a stamping press accident will, if they are fortunate, receive a replacement arm that functions adequately. It will not be elegant. It will not be comfortable. It will require maintenance that the worker themselves must learn to perform, using a kit of basic tools issued with the implant. And it will serve as a constant reminder that on a Forge world, the human body is a machine that the Mechanicus manages, not an individual that the Mechanicus respects. The medical infrastructure of a Forge world is extensive but not, in the conventional sense, compassionate. The Mechanicus maintains medici stations throughout its Forge complexes, staffed by chirurgeons, tech priests who specialize in the biological maintenance of human workers. These chirurgeons approach human medicine with the same methodological precision they bring to machine maintenance. An injury is a malfunction. A disease is a contaminant. The goal of treatment is restoration of function, not alleviation of suffering, and while the Mechanicus would not deliberately cause unnecessary suffering to its workers, the experience of receiving medical attention on a forge world is often clinical to a degree that borders on dehumanizing. Chirurgeons speak in technical terminology. They assess efficiency metrics rather than quality of life. They will repair a broken bone or treat a severe burn, but they will also calculate whether the cost of treatment outweighs the projected remaining productivity of the patient, and in cases where that calculation does not favor treatment, the outcome for the patient is not pleasant. Workers who develop conditions that reduce their productivity without being acute enough to warrant medical intervention simply work on deteriorating until they reach a threshold that the system recognizes as requiring attention, or until they die, whichever comes first. Religion on a forge world is the cult Mechanicus, and there is no other sanctioned option. The cult Mechanicus is not a religion in the way that the imperial cult is a religion. There is no emperor figure at its center, though the omnicia is sometimes equated with the emperor in ways that the more orthodox elements of the ecclesiarchy find uncomfortable. The cult Mechanicus is a technological theology, a framework of belief that treats knowledge as sacred, machines as holy, and the human body as an imperfect vessel in need of improvement. For the laboring caste, the cult Mechanicus expresses itself primarily through ritual, the recitation of machine psalms before beginning a shift, the correct sequence of maintenance prayers when starting or shutting down equipment, the observance of the rites of activation and deactivation that surround every piece of significant machinery on the forge floor. Workers who perform these rituals correctly are considered to be in good standing with the omnicia. Workers who skip them or perform them incorrectly risk the attention of their supervisors, and the attention of forge world supervisors is not a comfortable thing to attract. There is genuine faith among some workers, and it would be dishonest to deny this. In an environment as extreme as a forge world, where the machinery is enormous and ancient and in some ways incomprehensible, and where the line between a correctly functioning system and a catastrophic failure can be as thin as a single missed maintenance step, the idea that the machines have something like a spirit, that they can be pleased or displeased, that they respond to proper treatment with reliable function, is not entirely irrational. Experienced workers develop an intuitive understanding of the equipment they work with that can look, from the outside, remarkably like reverence. An old furnace tender who has worked the same machine for 30 years knows its sounds and its rhythms the way a musician knows an instrument, and when they perform the prescribed rituals of maintenance, some of them are doing so because they genuinely believe it matters, and some are doing so because experience has taught them that careful, methodical attention to a machine's needs produces better outcomes, and on a forge world, these two motivations arrive at the same behavior. Infractions and discipline on a forge world operate within a framework that is simultaneously bureaucratic and brutal. The Mechanicus maintains detailed records of worker performance, attendance, ritual compliance, productivity metrics, and behavior reports, and these records follow a worker throughout their life on the forge world. Minor infractions, missed rituals, small production shortfalls, interpersonal conflicts on the forge floor accumulate as marks against a worker's record and can affect their work assignment, their access to better quality rations, their eligibility for augmentation, and their eventual placement within the Mechanicus hierarchy. More serious infractions, sabotage, theft, violence, heresy against the cult Mechanicus, are handled by the Scutarii, the military arm of the Mechanicus, who maintain a presence on every forge world and who operate with a mandate that extends well beyond simple law enforcement. A worker who is found guilty of a serious infraction before a Mechanicus tribunal faces outcomes that range from corrective augmentation, the installation of implants that monitor behavior and deliver aversive stimuli for non-compliant actions, to reassignment to the most dangerous and degrading labor roles available, to death, which the Mechanicus will perform with the same efficient precision it brings to everything else. The concept of freedom is not one that forge world workers engage with in the way that citizens of more conventionally governed imperial worlds might. There are no elections on a forge world. There are no petitions, no forums for public debate, no mechanisms by which a worker can formally challenge a decision made by the Mechanicus hierarchy. What there is, instead, is a complex system of informal negotiation, the thousand small ways in which workers accommodate themselves to a system they cannot change while carving out the maximum possible space for personal agency within it. Slow working as a form of protest. Strategic incomprehension when faced with unreasonable demands. The cultivation of relationships with supervisors who respond to small favors. The collective maintenance of unofficial customs and practices that the Mechanicus has not formally sanctioned but has not bothered to eradicate because they do not measurably affect output. These are the freedoms of the Forge World worker, and they are real freedoms, even if they are not the ones that appear in any doctrine. Death on a Forge world is frequent and unremarkable. Industrial environments operating at the scale and intensity of a Forge world generate casualties at a rate that would be considered catastrophic in almost any other context, and the Mechanicus response to worker death is primarily administrative. When a worker dies on the forge floor, from equipment failure, from a falling load, from heat stroke, from a chemical burn, from the simple catastrophic bad luck that industrial environments generate in abundance, the body is logged, the position is noted, and a replacement is assigned. There is no formal ceremony. There are no official condolences. The machinery does not stop. On some forge worlds, particularly old ones with long traditions, work gangs have developed their own informal memorial practices. A moment of silence, a particular phrase spoken among themselves, the placement of a small mark on the equipment their colleague tended. These practices are not sanctioned and not prohibited. They are simply not visible to the hierarchy, because the hierarchy is not looking for them. The children who grow up watching this happen absorb a particular relationship with mortality that shapes everything else about them. They learn early that lives are not precious on a forge world in the way that ecclesiarchy sermons suggest human lives are precious in the sight of the emperor. They learn that the body is a tool, and that tools wear out, and that the forge world continues operating regardless. Some of them carry this knowledge with them into a kind of numbness, a protective detachment from the weight of loss that allows them to continue functioning in an environment where loss is constant. Others carry it into something sharper, a controlled anger, a burning awareness of the gap between the Mechanicus doctrine that theoretically values them as components of the holy mechanism and the daily reality of their lives. This anger is almost never expressed openly, because the consequences of open expression are severe. But it persists and it shapes and it is passed down, and it is one of the forge world's most consistent products even if it never appears on any production manifest. The question of what workers on a forge world know about the wider Imperium is interesting and not straightforward to answer. Information on a forge world is managed carefully by the Mechanicus, which has its own communications infrastructure and its own relationship with the news and data that flows through the Imperium. Workers in the laboring caste receive the information that the Mechanicus chooses to provide them: doctrinal content, production-relevant announcements, approved historical narratives, and the highly filtered version of current events that the Mechanicus deems appropriate for its workforce to know. The existence of war in the galaxy is not concealed, because the entire purpose of the forge world is war production and workers are aware of this. But the specific nature of the threats the Imperium faces, the political tensions between the Mechanicus and the ecclesiarchy and the administratum, the scale of the losses being suffered on various fronts, this kind of contextual information does not flow freely to the laboring caste. Workers know that they are making weapons and vehicles and ammunition. They know these things go to war. They know the war is continuous and vast. The meaning of all of this, the full context of what they are part of, is something that most forge world workers construct from fragments. Overheard conversations, rumors passed along work gangs, the occasional smuggled document, the observations of a worker who has spent time near a void port and seen the ships coming in and going out. The Scutarii, who serve as the forge world's military and security force, occupy a different stratum from the laboring caste but are in many ways products of the same system. Many Scutarii are recruited from the laboring population, selected in adolescence for physical aptitude, augmented more extensively than the laboring caste, trained in the arts of war alongside the arts of machine doctrine, and assigned to the defensive and enforcement roles that the Mechanicus requires. For a laboring caste worker, selection for Scutarii service is simultaneously an elevation and a transformation. You become something more than a laborer, but you also become something definitively less than fully human, as the augmentation required for Scutarii service is extensive enough to meaningfully alter both physical capability and, in some formulations of the relevant tech priest doctrine, certain aspects of personality and memory. Former laborers who are incorporated into the Scutarii sometimes return to the forge floors they grew up on in their new capacity as enforcers, and the dynamic this creates. Someone who knows the hidden passages and the informal customs and the concealed anger of a labor district, now wearing the authority of the Mechanicus, is a complicated one that forge world workers navigate with the careful pragmatism that characterizes their approach to almost everything. The forge world itself has a character that varies significantly from planet to planet within the Adeptus Mechanicus. Mars is the oldest and most revered, and its workers carry the weight of that history. They are part of the most sacred forge in the Imperium, and this is a source of a complicated pride that coexists with the same grinding conditions that characterize every other forge world. Ryza is known for its plasma technology and for the particular intensity of its production tempo. Griffin 4 was consumed by the Tyranid hive fleets, and its workers died in numbers too large to comprehend defending a world that the hive mind found nutritious in a way that had nothing to do with metal or promethium. Metallica is loud even by Forge World standards. If you can imagine a scale on which Forge Worlds are ranked by the sheer volume of their industrial operations, Metallica occupies the upper end of it. Styges 8 has a reputation for theological heterodoxy that makes more orthodox Forge Worlds uncomfortable, and this reputation filters down into the culture of its laboring caste in ways that are subtle but real. Each Forge World is its own universe, its own closed system of doctrine and hierarchy and production, and the workers born into one of them are in most cases born into the only universe they will ever know. Travel off a Forge World for a laboring caste worker is exceptionally rare and typically involuntary. Workers do not take holidays. Workers do not emigrate to more pleasant imperial worlds. Workers are bonded to their Forge World in a way that is part contractual, part doctrinal, and part simply practical. The skills and experience of a Forge World worker are valuable primarily within the Forge World context, and the Mechanicus does not invest in workforce development with the expectation that its investments will walk away. Workers who are transported off-world are usually being moved because the Forge World itself is in danger, being evacuated ahead of an enemy advance, or because a specific work detail is required elsewhere, accompanying a piece of machinery or a production installation that is being established on another world. Workers who find themselves off-world for any reason frequently report a vertiginous disorientation, a difficulty adjusting to natural light and open air, and the absence of the machinery noise that has formed the constant backdrop of their existence. Several accounts from Forge World workers who ended up on conventional imperial worlds through one unusual circumstance or another describe the sound of wind in the open air as deeply unsettling. Not because it is unpleasant, but because it sounds like nothing they have ever heard before, and because the absence of the familiar industrial roar in which they have spent their lives is experienced not as relief but as something closer to bereavement. The philosophical question of what Forge World workers make of their own existence, whether they find meaning in it, whether they accept the Mechanicus framing of their labor as sacred service, whether they resent the system or accept it or find ways to transcend it, does not have a single answer because Forge World workers are not a single thing. They are the full range of human beings placed in an extraordinarily constrained set of circumstances, and they respond to those circumstances with the full complexity that human beings bring to everything. Some genuinely believe in the theology of the omnia and find in it a framework that makes their labor meaningful. They are tending the sacred machines, they are feeding the holy mechanism of the Imperium's survival, and this is a worthy thing to do with a life even if the life is hard. Some do not believe and have never believed, and maintain the external forms of ritual compliance because the alternative is worse, and underneath the compliance carry a private relationship with their own existence that the Mechanicus would neither recognize nor approve of. Some have found, within the brutal constraints of the Forge World, something genuine community, genuine skill, genuine satisfaction in the mastery of their craft, however narrow and specific that craft might be. And some are simply surviving day by cycle by shift, putting one foot in front of the other because that is the only direction available. The relationship between Forge World workers and the concept of heresy is particularly complicated because the Mechanicus definition of heresy is, in some respects, broader than the imperial definition and in other respects narrower. Worshipping the wrong god, the ruinous powers, for instance, is heresy under both frameworks, and the consequences are severe under both frameworks. But in the Mechanicus system, there are additional categories of doctrinal deviation that are unique to the technological faith. The use of certain forbidden technologies is heresy. The improper operation of certain classes of machinery is heresy. The hoarding or concealment of technical knowledge that should be shared with the omniscia's servants is heresy. On the other hand, the kind of personal spiritual heterodoxy that might attract the ecclesiarchy's attention on a conventional imperial world, questioning the divine nature of the emperor, for instance, or maintaining private religious practices outside the approved framework, is less uniformly addressed by the Mechanicus, which is focused primarily on technological compliance and will sometimes overlook personal spiritual deviations that do not affect production. This creates spaces in the margins of the Forge World's doctrinal surveillance, where workers maintain fragments of older beliefs, family traditions carried from whatever world their ancestors were brought from, small devotions and superstitions that have survived generations of technological theology without ever quite being stamped out. There is a ghost culture on a forge world, beneath the official culture, a layer of belief and practice and knowledge that is not found in any Mechanicus document and is not transmitted through any official channel. It includes the informal memorial practices already described. It includes a complex folk medicine that workers use to supplement the Mechanicus station's clinical care, remedies made from industrial materials that have been repurposed, treatments passed down through families, an empirical tradition of what works for specific forge world ailments that is sometimes more effective than the official doctrine because it has been refined through generations of direct experience with conditions that the chirurgeons have never had to personally suffer. It includes stories, oral traditions of the forge world's history that differ from the official Mechanicus account, tales of past disasters and past injustices and past moments of worker resistance that have been softened or erased from the formal record but survive in the telling. It includes a complex system of social signaling, particular words, particular gestures, particular ways of arranging the small personal objects that workers are permitted to keep in their sleeping alcoves, that conveys information within a work gang without attracting the attention of supervisors. These are the hidden technologies of the laboring caste, as sophisticated in their own way as anything the Mugos Technicus oversees, and they have been maintained and refined and transmitted with the same dedicated care that the Mechanicus gives to its most treasured standard template constructs. What the forge world ultimately asks of its workers is total submission to a purpose that they did not choose, in conditions they did not select, for a duration that encompasses their entire lives. It asks them to give everything they have and to find in the giving a framework of meaning sufficient to sustain them, because the alternative, a workforce that has given up meaning entirely, would be an inefficient workforce, and inefficiency is heresy. The Mechanicus is not unaware that its workers need something beyond calories and sleep cycles to function as productive components of the holy mechanism. This awareness expresses itself in the provision of the cult Mechanicus as a comprehensive meaning structure, in the maintenance of a hierarchy that offers at least the theoretical possibility of advancement, in the augmentation programs that promise transformation even as they deliver service, in the formal and informal allowances for community that exist throughout the forge world system. Whether this is sufficient, whether the meaning provided matches the meaning demanded, is not a question that the Mechanicus poses to itself, because posing it would imply that the question has a meaningful answer, and the Mechanicus has already determined that it does not. But the workers pose it, silently, in the spaces between shifts, in the brief darkness before exhaustion takes them under, in the moments when the machine psalm pauses and the only sound is the breathing of hundreds of sleeping bodies and the ever-present background hum of machinery that never stops. They pose it in the particular way that humans in extreme circumstances always do. Not necessarily in words, not necessarily even in conscious thought, but in the shaping of their lives, in the choices they make within the narrow range available to them, in the relationships they build and the small rebellions they commit and the stories they tell each other in the dark. They are asking whether it is enough. Whether this is enough. Whether a life spent in service to the machine, in the heat and the noise and the smoke and the never-ending rhythm of production, with the augmetics slowly accumulating and the organic body slowly wearing down, with the quota always waiting to be met and the supervisor always watching and the machine psalm always playing and the ash always falling, whether this life is worth the living of it. To understand the texture of daily life more fully, it helps to follow a single worker through a single cycle, and for this purpose consider a woman in her mid-30s, though she looks older because the forge world accelerates age the way it accelerates production without sentiment, working a mid-tier station on a vehicle assembly line. She was born in this forge world's residential District 7, which is one of the older residential zones, built during an expansion 3 centuries ago when the forge needed more workers than the existing bonded population could supply and drew new families in from 3 different subsector worlds. Her family has been here for 2 generations before her, and her own children, 2 of them, are currently in the creche and early education system, absorbing the catechisms that she herself absorbed and that she recites now with the fluency of something that has been internalized so completely it no longer requires conscious processing. She lost the ring finger of her left hand to a conveyor belt malfunction 8 years ago. The replacement is a decent augmetic, not uncomfortable, functional, capable of gripping and lifting as required, but it does not quite match the temperature of the rest of her hand, and in the colder sections of the assembly hall she is always aware of it, a small constant reminder. The chirurgeon who fitted it told her she was lucky. She agreed because the chirurgeon was holding the tools at the time, and because she has learned over 3 decades of Forge World existence that the appropriate response to almost any statement made by a person with authority is agreement, followed by quiet reevaluation in private. Her shift begins with the machine psalm, which is recited collectively by the work gang as they take their stations. It is a long recitation. Technically, the full version runs to 47 verses, but the version performed at shift start is an abbreviated form of 14 verses that the gang can complete in approximately 6 minutes. She knows it so well that she recites it from a place behind her active attention, the way a person can walk a familiar path while thinking about something completely different. While the words of the psalm move through her, she is running through her mental checklist for the assembly station, checking the state of the components that arrived on the overnight supply run, noting which of the standard preformed housing units is slightly misaligned on the input rack, calculating how this misalignment will interact with the automated positioning system and whether it will require manual adjustment or will self-correct within the first few production cycles. These are the skills of a person who has worked the same station for 11 years, and they are real skills, detailed and sophisticated, even if the Mechanicus labor taxonomy classifies her role as Category 4, which is the second lowest category in the formal system and carries a resource allocation tier that reflects accordingly. The first 4 hours of her shift are the most physically demanding. The assembly line is producing hull components for a medium-weight transport vehicle, and the work involves repeated lifting, positioning, and securing of components that weigh between 8 and 40 kilograms. The assembly station has mechanical assists for the heaviest lifts, and these are used, but there is a particular kind of cumulative physical strain that comes from spending 4 hours performing variations on the same set of movements, and by the midpoint of the first half shift her shoulders carry it and her lower back carries it and the augmetic finger carries it differently from the organic ones. The break, when it comes, is 20 minutes. She drinks from the water station, eats the protein block she brought from the feeding station earlier, and sits with her back against the wall of the assembly hall. Not the floor, because the floor is perpetually filmed with a thin layer of industrial oil and metal particulate, and she closes her eyes for 3 minutes and does something that is not quite sleeping and not quite waking, a state that Forge World workers develop and that has no precise clinical name but that functions as a compressed form of recovery. Then she opens her eyes, finishes the water, and goes back. The middle section of her shift is the intellectually interesting part, at least in the terms that her working environment makes available. A component variance arrives. One of the input housings has a manufacturing deviation that is small enough to fall within nominal tolerance, but large enough to affect fit when combined with a specific other component that appears later in the assembly sequence. She identifies this not through any formal variance detection protocol but through the particular attentiveness that long experience produces, a sense that something is not quite right with the way the component is sitting in the positioning jig. She flags it through the approved reporting channel, which means logging it in the assembly station's data terminal using the standard variance notation codes. The data will be reviewed by a Mugos Technicus at some point, possibly today, possibly next week, and a formal determination will be made. In the meantime, she continues working, compensating manually for the variance in the components she can identify, knowing that some will pass through her station unidentified and that the consequence of this will be expressed somewhere down the assembly line as a fit problem requiring rework, which will slow production, which will appear on someone's quota shortfall report, which will ultimately be attributed to a systemic component quality issue rather than to anything she did or failed to do. This is how the accountability system works on a Forge world, and she has made her peace with the parts of it she cannot change. The final hours of her shift are the hardest in a different way from the first hours, not physically harder but mentally denser, because the body is tired and the attention is worn and the assembly line does not slow to accommodate this. This is when errors happen. She knows this. She actively manages her attention through these hours with techniques she developed herself over years, varying the rhythm of her movements slightly to prevent pure autopilot, checking her own output against quality markers at shorter intervals than the protocol requires, maintaining a kind of internal running commentary on what she is doing that keeps the conscious mind engaged with the work rather than drifting. These are not techniques anyone taught her. They are things she figured out because she is good at her job, and she is good at her job not because the Mechanicus told her to be but because she has decided that this is the thing she has and she will be good at it. When the shift ends, the closing psalm is shorter than the opening one, 7 verses, performed at the station before shutdown. Then the long walk through the corridors, past the checkpoints, down the transit tunnels. The Forge World's internal transit system connects the major work districts to the residential districts, and at shift change it is densely packed with workers moving in both directions, the departing shift and the arriving one flowing past each other in the wide corridors with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this 10,000 times. She has a route she prefers, which avoids the worst of the crowding by using a secondary tunnel that most people don't know connects to the main transit junction. She learned it from an older worker who retired 3 years ago, part of the informal knowledge network that is one of the Forge world's true intellectual inheritances. The feeding station meal. The check on the creche records to confirm her children are accounted for, because the creche operates its own shift system and the children have typically been transferred to the sleeping facility before she returns. She can see them twice per cycle, in the brief period between her return from shift and the start of the rest period. It is not much time. It is what there is. The conversations are short and dense. She asks them questions about what they learned. They tell her things in the compressed, excited way of children who have more to say than time allows. She processes what they say for signs of any concern she needs to address. She tells them that she loves them in the specific words that her own mother used to use, words that came from her mother's world, carried across the stars and across 2 generations and surviving still in the residential corridors of Forge World District 7. Then the rest period begins and the children go to sleep and she allows herself to follow them, and the machinery hums beneath her and the lights are never fully dark and somewhere on the levels below the furnaces burn on, and she sleeps and tomorrow the cycle repeats. This is one life on one Forge world, and the Forge worlds of the Adeptus Mechanicus number in the dozens across the galaxy, each of them carrying millions of lives like this one, each of them constituting an entire universe of experience that no single observer could fully map or comprehend. The sheer scale of the human story being lived inside these industrial cathedral planets is staggering when you try to hold it all at once. The aggregate weight of it, the accumulated years and losses and adaptations and resistances and small joys and enormous sorrows that make up the total experience of the Forge world workforce across the Imperium. The Mechanicus does not try to hold it all at once because the Mechanicus operates at the level of aggregate output and doctrinal compliance, and the individual stories that constitute that aggregate are not, from the Mechanicus administrative perspective, the primary unit of analysis. But they are the primary unit of reality. They are what is actually happening in the heat and the noise and the smoke, at the level where a woman checks her augmetic finger against the cold and keeps working. The numbers that appear on a Mugos Logus's production manifest, the tonnage of processed steel, the unit count of completed vehicles, the efficiency rating of a given assembly district, these numbers are made of people. They are made of exhausted bodies performing skilled work in brutal conditions for a length of time that constitutes their entire conscious existence. They are made of children falling asleep in creches and workers dying quietly of conditions they do not have precise names for and work gangs maintaining invisible traditions that no Mechanicus census has ever captured. They are made of the full and irreducible complexity of human life operating inside constraints that no human life was designed to accommodate, and finding a way to persist anyway, and passing that persistence down and continuing. The Mugos who oversees a major Forge world district sees, in his data feeds, a production zone operating at a certain percentage of optimal capacity. He sees resource allocation figures, workforce health metrics expressed in aggregate, incident reports, variance logs. He does not see the particular way that the workers in Assembly Bay 14 have arranged their stations so that the 2 workers who are in a long-term relationship with each other have adjacent positions and can exchange brief words during component transfers without technically violating the no personal contact protocols. He does not see the small cairn of metal scraps that the workers in Furnace Section 9 have built in a corner behind the secondary coolant outlet, 1 scrap for each of their colleagues who has died at that station, maintained and added to for 40 years without anyone in the Mechanicus hierarchy being aware of its existence. He does not see the songs, technically, the machine psalm variations that the workers in the transit tunnels sing to themselves on the long walk between Residential District 4 and the Outer Forge Complex, variations that have drifted so far from the original doctrinal text that a reclusiarch of the cult Mechanicus would probably classify them as heterodoxy but which the workers experience simply as theirs, as something made by them and belonging to them in a world where almost nothing belongs to them at all. All of this is invisible to the official record. All of it is as real as the production quotas. And all of it will continue as long as the Forge world continues, which is to say as long as the Imperium has need of it, which is to say for as long as anyone can see in any direction. The wars do not end. The demand for weapons does not end. The furnaces do not cool. And the people inside the forge world, the bonded laborers and the experienced assembly workers and the children being shaped by the catechisms and the creche workers and the informal healers and the storytellers in the dark. They continue too, living and working and dying and being replaced and carrying forward in the time they have the full weight of everything that it means to be human in circumstances that seem designed to make humanity an irrelevant variable. It is not a comfortable thing to contemplate. The forge world is not a comfortable place to contemplate, even from a very great distance, even from the comfortable position of someone who is not in it. But it is real, and the people in it are real, and the complexity of what they experience deserves more than the cold notation of a Mechanicus efficiency report. The forge world is one of the Imperium's most essential and most terrible institutions, and the gap between those two things, between essential and terrible, is where its workers live, in the heat and the noise and the dark, in the company of their families and their work gangs and their quietly maintained customs, looking up occasionally at a sky they cannot see and thinking thoughts that no doctrine has quite managed to eradicate, because doctrine is very powerful, but it is not quite as powerful as a person sitting alone for a few minutes in the dark, away from the machines, finally quiet enough to hear their own mind, and wondering. The forge world does not answer this question. The forge world continues producing. The furnaces burn. The stamping presses rise and fall. The lathes turn. The conveyor systems roll on. There is something worth dwelling on in the specific relationship that forge world workers develop with time. Elsewhere in the Imperium, time is a thing that most humans experience in relation to natural cycles. The rotation of a planet, the movement of seasons, the familiar progression of a day from morning to night and back again. These cycles are the scaffolding around which human culture organizes itself. Festivals, rest days, the liturgical calendar of the ecclesiarchy. All of these depend on the existence of a shared temporal framework rooted in the natural world. On a forge world, this scaffolding does not exist. There is no natural world visible from inside the forge complex. There are production cycles, maintenance schedules, shift rotations, and doctrinal observances keyed to the Mechanicus calendar, which is itself a highly technical document more concerned with the timing of sacred maintenance rituals than with anything a worker might experience as a meaningful marker of time's passage. What this does to a person's relationship with time is subtle but profound. Workers on forge worlds often report a compressed, blurred experience of temporal passage, the sense that years have gone by faster than they should have, that the distinction between one cycle and the next has never been quite sharp enough to anchor memory to specific moments. Ask a forge world worker to tell you what was happening 5 years ago, and they will frequently struggle to differentiate that time from 3 years ago or 7 years ago, because the texture of the days was the same and the markers that normally help memory locate events in sequence were absent. The exceptions are moments of disruption, accidents, unusual events, the birth of children, the death of close colleagues. And these events stand out with unusual sharpness against the uniform background of forge world time, vivid and precise in a way that normal days are not. This is why the informal memorial traditions are so important to forge world workers. They are not only expressions of grief or solidarity. They are temporal anchors. They are the way that forge world workers mark the passage of time in a world that provides no other way to mark it. The Mechanicus calendar does provide a structure of sorts, through its observances and rites. The Feast of the Omniscia, the rites of awakening at the beginning of major production cycles, the memorial observances for forge worlds lost to enemy action or catastrophic malfunction, these events punctuate the otherwise undifferentiated flow of forge world time. Workers observe them with the expected ritual compliance, and some of them find in these observances a genuine sense of temporal structure, a feeling that the year or whatever unit of time the forge world calendar uses has a shape. But the observances are also, fundamentally, about production. They are timed to align with production cycle transitions. They are designed to reinforce doctrinal compliance and workforce motivation, and the spiritual experience they offer is inseparable from their function as productivity tools. Workers who are spiritually inclined toward the cult Mechanicus can find in them genuine meaning. Workers who are not find them another obligation to discharge efficiently, like the morning psalm, like the safety protocols, like everything else. The relationship of forge world workers with beauty is one that outside observers often find surprising, because the assumption is that an environment as relentlessly functional as a forge world would extinguish the aesthetic impulse completely. This assumption underestimates the aesthetic impulse and misunderstands the forge world. Workers who inhabit this environment develop, over time and out of necessity, an aesthetic sensibility calibrated to it. They find beauty in the forge world's own terms, the particular way that light from a furnace aperture catches the metal dust in the air and turns it into something that looks, briefly, like suspended gold. The satisfying symmetry of a correctly assembled component, everything aligned and seated as it should be, every tolerance met, the thing made perfectly. The sound of the machinery in its proper rhythm, the way a correctly maintained production system has a particular acoustic signature that experienced workers can read as easily as music. This is not compensation for the absence of conventional beauty. It is the development of a genuine aesthetic sensibility shaped by a specific environment, and it is one of the ways in which forge world culture is not simply a lesser version of culture elsewhere but a different thing entirely. The oral tradition of forge world workers is one of the Imperium's least documented cultural forms, for the obvious reason that the Mechanicus does not document it. What fragments do exist, in the records of imperial missionaries who have served on forge worlds, in the testimonies of refugees from forge worlds consumed by enemy action, suggest a tradition that is rich, complex, and highly specific to its context. The stories and code information about the forge world environment and the history of particular districts alongside the emotional and moral content that distinguishes story from mere instruction. They feature protagonists who are workers of the laboring caste, and the moral orientation of these stories tends to value cleverness, endurance, loyalty to the work gang, and the ability to extract dignity from difficult circumstances over the official virtues of doctrinal compliance. The heroes of forge world stories are usually people who found a way through, who managed the impossible quota or survived the impossible accident or maintained their essential humanity in conditions that seemed designed to eliminate it. These are the figures that forge world culture honors, in its quiet and unofficial way, because these are the kinds of success that forge world conditions make possible and that no official measure is calibrated to detect. The future of any individual forge world worker is both entirely predictable and impossible to know. Predictable because the structure of a forge world life follows patterns that do not change much. The progression from entry-level laborer to experienced worker, the accumulation of augmetics as the body requires repair or as productivity thresholds are met, the eventual decline in physical capacity and the reassignment to roles that make better use of experience than raw physical output, the final transition into the categories that the Mechanicus labels legacy worker, which means a person whose direct production contribution is minimal but whose role as a keeper of institutional knowledge and an informal trainer of newer workers still has value, for a time. Impossible to know because the galaxy is not a safe place and forge worlds are not exempt from its dangers. A forge world can be attacked. A forge world can be blockaded and its supply lines cut, producing conditions of privation that alter everything. A forge world can be hit by a warp storm that isolates it for years or decades. A forge world can fail, catastrophically, completely in the way that Griffin 4 failed, and when a forge world fails its workers go with it because there is generally nowhere else for them to go and often no time to go there. This possibility, the catastrophic end, the sudden apocalyptic conclusion to a life lived in gradual increments, is one that forge world workers are aware of without quite knowing how to think about it, because the Mechanicus does not train its workers in existential risk assessment and because the range of catastrophes that can end a forge world is so extreme that no practical preparation is possible. What can be prepared for, and what forge world workers spend their practical energy preparing for, is the manageable scale of difficulty, the workplace injury, the illness, the loss of a colleague, the quota that cannot be met, the supervisor who cannot be reasoned with, the child whose creche placement is inadequate, the augmetic that is malfunctioning in a way that the Medici station has not yet had time to address. These are the problems that constitute the actual texture of a forge world life, and the skills that forge world workers develop for addressing them are as real and as valuable as any technical skill the Mechanicus formally recognizes. Managing these problems requires social intelligence, patience, creativity within severe constraints, the ability to assess risk accurately under conditions of incomplete information, and the kind of resilience that is not dramatic or heroic but quiet and daily and absolutely essential. These are the skills that forge world culture transmits, from older workers to younger ones, from parents to children, from the experienced members of a work gang to the newest arrivals. They are the true curriculum of the forge world, taught not in any doctrinal schoolroom but in the corridors and the feeding stations and the sleeping quarters and the brief pauses during shifts when one worker, slightly more experienced, gives another worker, slightly less, a piece of information or advice that is not in any manual and that may save them a great deal of trouble. And somewhere in all of it, somewhere in the vast churning engine of a forge world in full production, with its millions of workers and its ancient machines and its sacred doctrines and its invisible culture and its perpetual smoke and its furnaces that never cool and its quotas that never end and its people who love each other and mourn each other and remember each other and carry each other forward through cycles that blur into years that blur into generations. Somewhere in all of it, the forge world continues to be, simultaneously, one of the most important and one of the most costly things that the Imperium of man has ever built. Important because without it the armies of the Emperor would have no weapons and the navies of the Emperor would have no ships and the defenses of 10,000 worlds would have no material with which to hold the line against the darkness that presses in from every direction. Costly because the currency in which forge worlds operate is not primarily promethium or processed steel, but human time, human life, human experience, poured in at one end of the mechanism in quantities that no ledger fully captures, and coming out the other end as the instruments of a war that has no foreseeable conclusion. This is the forge world, and this is what it means to live inside one, and the people who do are neither the mindless drones of a simplistic dystopian imagining, nor the contented servants of official Mechanicus doctrine. They are people, full and complete, living in the hardest circumstances that human civilization has yet managed to produce and maintain, carrying everything that people carry wherever they go, and finding in the carrying something that is worth the wait. Or finding it sometimes. Or not quite finding it but continuing anyway because the forge world offers no alternative, and because the children are sleeping and the furnaces are burning and tomorrow the cycle starts again and there is work to be done, sacred and terrible and entirely human and entirely real. The forge world does not answer this question. The forge world continues producing. The furnaces burn. The stamping presses rise and fall. The lathes turn. The conveyor systems roll on. And somewhere inside all of it, buried under the smoke and the noise and the heat and the doctrine and the ritual and the machine psalm and the oil prayer, there are human beings trying to live. And somewhere inside all of it, in the margins and the gaps, in the dark spaces between the holy mechanisms, people live in the fullest sense that the word can sustain. Not despite the forge world, not in harmony with it, but alongside it in the complicated, defiant, irreducible way that human beings live wherever they find themselves because they are human beings, and that is what human beings do, even on a forge world, even in the 41st millennium, even when the galaxy is dark and the stars are dying and the machines are everything and the flesh is considered a limitation to be transcended. They live, and they remember, and they tell each other stories in the dark, and the forge world burns on around them, indifferent and eternal, and the smoke rises and rises and never quite clears.